Thanks for checking out my video, Defining Heavy Metal. This is part 4, so make sure you check out the other videos in the series. Groove metal begins in the late 80s and early 90s, with inspiration from thrash bands as well as incorporating traditional heavy metal elements, with a heavy emphasis on aggression. Rather than focus on speed like in thrash metal, groove metal will often slow down to a mid-tempo, using downtuned guitars and heavy distortion to create a very heavy groove. Vocals are aggressive, usually yelling or screaming, or sung in a very gravel-sounding manner. Black Sabbath songs like Into the Void could be considered an early influence on this genre, but bands that have spearheaded the style would be Exhorder, Pantera, and White Zombie. Machine Head, Chimera, and Lamb of God would go on to take it even a step further. In the 90s, after grunge rock, buried glam metal, and interest in bands displaying highly technical skills began to decline, a new kind of metal began to emerge. Combining grunge with alternative metal, it was simply called nu metal. There would be a great deal of crossover between alternative metal and nu metal, both exploring heavier sounds with unorthodox elements mixed in. An emphasis on simpler chord structures, heavily downtuned guitars, and virtually no guitar solos. Vocals often involved harsh screaming, and the aesthetic was dingy, baggy clothes, beat-up instruments, and dreadlocks. Both visually and sonically, it was the complete antithesis of glam metal. During this period, bands who showed proficiency in technical skill were often publicly shunned and mocked by the nu metal and grunge fanbase. The effect of this on the music industry was so great that by the late 90s, even Slayer and Metallica went to great efforts to change their style. Both albums feature the lowest tunings either band has ever used, and the Metallica album does not include a single guitar solo. The poster child for nu metal would be Korn, with the release of their first video on MTV in January of 1995. Other popular nu metal acts include Limp Bizkit, Cold Chamber, and Godhead. Marilyn Manson falls more into the alternative metal category with a very heavy dose of shock, but was associated with several nu metal acts as well. Mushroomhead, Slipknot, and Mudvayne all brought in an element of shock rock theatrics as well, with all three eventually exploring beyond the nu metal confines, such as Mudvayne's shift into more progressive elements later. By the early 2000s, nu metal's popularity began to give way to metalcore. Combining hardcore punk with metal, metalcore tends to lie somewhere between groove metal and death metal. Faster tempos with double bass drumming are combined with the use of breakdowns, intended to slow the tempo down and encourage moshing. Guitars are typically always downtuned to some degree, with vocalists usually screaming. Sometimes a mix of screaming and clean singing is used, with the clean vocals most often sung over the chorus. Death growls are also sometimes used in place of screaming, and guitar solos are optional, depending on the song or even the band. Earth Crisis, Hatebreed, Lamb of God, Unearth, Killswitch Engage, and Trivium are all associated with metalcore. Over the years, various shoot-offs of metalcore have developed, including mathcore, progressive metalcore, and deathcore, among others.
I went looking for trouble. And boy, I found her. She's in love with herself.
Gothic metal gets its roots from the Gothic rock movement of the 80s and blending it with doom metal. But it's a bit harder to pin down as its own subgenre because there really isn't a distinct musical sound or style that's unique to Gothic metal. Rather, the term Gothic metal tends to latch on to bands and other genres based on more of an aesthetic approach. The style of Gothic subculture includes lots of black clothing, dark makeup, typically black hair, even if it has to be dyed, but later would include different unnatural colors like blue, green, or purple, and then spikes and leather combined with lace, and a mixture of Victorian fashion elements. Subject matters that are prevalent in the Gothic subculture would include vampires and werewolves. With that said, labeling a band as Gothic metal will not ensure that they all follow a common theme or musical style. Typo Negative, Moonspell, and My Dying Bride are all considered key figures in Gothic metal. Lacuna Coil, In This Moment, and Semblant would also fall into this category. Cradle of Filth, once again skirting their way along numerous genres, have heavy Gothic influences, and even later Marilyn Manson albums could fit in here as well. And yet, all of these bands sound very different from each other. We're getting to some of the outliers and near the end of my list for this video, so I'll try to run through some of these a little quicker. Folk metal is a fusion of metal with traditional folk music, often employing multiple authentic folk instruments like violins and hurdy-gurdies. The music styles can vary, but generally it's an old European music style that's interlaced with modern metal music. Vocals favor a clean singing approach, but this too can vary. Lyric themes will often center around a country's culture and history, as well as mythology and paganism. Many will choose to sing in their native languages rather than in English, although there are still many that do sing in English, or even sometimes a blending of the two. I apologize in advance if I end up butchering any of these names. Crohan from Ireland, Korpiklani from Finland, Heidevolk from the Netherlands, Ensiferum from Finland, Elvati from Switzerland, and Fintroll, also from Finland. Viking metal is similar to goth metal in that there's no distinct musical style that sets this genre apart. In fact, it's not really a genre on its own, it's more like just a common lyrical theme. But I'm covering it here because it's quite popular and a very widely used term. Viking metal is simply metal bands singing about Vikings. Many will adopt a Viking aesthetic, but musically they can range from death metal to traditional metal and anywhere in between, including folk metal. Bathory's Hammerheart is considered one of the earliest metal albums to fully embrace the Viking subject. Amane Marth, Tyr, Skalmode, and Borknagar are all considered Viking metal, all with distinctly different musical styles. At this point, I would like to include a sort of honorary mention. Although neither of these two bands are metal at all, many fans of folk metal and Viking metal are also fans of these more traditional folk bands, Heilung and Skald. If you enjoy either of the previous two genres that I mentioned, then they are definitely worth checking out.
Piracy's a crime and crime doesn't pay, and we go home poor at the end of the day. But I'd rather live my life in rags than be chained to a desk with a wife that's a hag. We live each day like a...
Pirate metal is like Viking metal in that it's more of just a lyrical theme than a musical style. Musically, it's just more folk metal, except they sing about pirates. Just start your journey into pirate metal with Ailstorm and you won't be disappointed. Kawaii metal comes from Japan, and it's very Japanese. Kawaii literally translates to cute or extremely cute. The name comes from the Kawaii subculture in Japan. Think Hello Kitty. This is blended with aggressive metal to create something different. This blending of two seemingly opposites spawned baby metal. Yes, that's the actual name of the band, not a new genre. Baby metal has gone on to become a worldwide sensation, so I'm including them here as the primary example of Kawaii metal. If you want to journey further down that rabbit hole, do so at your own risk. For our final metal subgenre in this video series, Djent is a relatively new term that's been applied to another form of extreme metal. The name is an onomatopoeia of the sound that a distorted guitar makes when you are palm muting. Djent is essentially an offshoot of progressive death metal, sharing many similar traits. Djent bands will typically play tuned down as much as 4 or 5 full steps below standard tuning. 7 and 8 string guitars are often employed to achieve this. Djent has also jokingly been referred to as binary metal due to the heavy use of staccato rhythms played on the 0 and 1 neck positions. Examples of Djent bands would include Meshuggah, Periphery, and Tesseract, although these bands could easily fall under the progressive death metal as well. There you have it, a brief rundown of the more common metal subgenres. There are many, many more genres with many, many more bands that I just simply can't cover. But hopefully this will give you a better idea of where certain bands fit, and I hope you are able to sample several of the bands that I've mentioned in each subgenre to gain a better understanding of what metal is all about and those specific categories. And remember, these are all guidelines, not rules. Thanks for watching. Now turn it up and go do some headbanging. Have a great day.